So this chapter we're going to look at here is on the middle years, including what was known as the empty nest syndrome, but we have had some transitions, so it's titled a little differently. So the middle years of the family are the time of transition. The current trend towards smaller families means that some parents are finished with child rearing while still quite young, relatively. Other parents, they find that their adult children are staying home longer, or if they do leave, they may return in a cycle that is called the revolving door. Now, since life expectancy is also increasing, most parents can look forward to many years of life without children in the home. However, they may have to care for their own aging parents, and I will get into that as well. There are a number of questions that need to be considered. What factors influence families at this stage of life? What happens to the couple's relationship during this period? What impact, if any, do poor employment possibilities for young people have on family relationships? With an increase in life expectancy, what pressures are placed on the middle-aged children of aging parents? What does all this mean for families and for society? Now, many of you may, some of you at least, will be in families at this stage of your life and development cycle where you should be able to see some interesting and maybe personally meaningful discussions with them regarding, as your family ages, who's going to look after your parents? Is that me? How are my siblings going to be involved? At what point do I divide up my looking after my own children with looking out after my parents? So this chapter is really looking at all that sort of stuff. So we're going to begin by looking at the middle years as a time of change. So let's look at this sort of time for change. As a life stage, the middle years, or middle age, is a relatively new stage. It hasn't been something we've had throughout time. The current trend towards smaller families means that parents are finished with child rearing earlier. And since life expectancy is also increasing, most adults can look forward to many years of life without children in the home. Now, there are many other questions to be considered, and we're going to start looking at some of these considerations. So what influences or what factors can influence families at this stage of life? Well, current midlife generation, the baby boomers, in 2011 statistics had it listed that those between the ages of 45 and 64 years of age were at nearly 9.31 million people. They outnumbered those in that 35 to 45 age group by almost double. That age group, 35 to 44, were at 4.6 million. The median age of Canadian population is at 39.9, so just about 40 years of age. And it's expected to get higher, rising up to about 44 as the baby boomers age. Now, the baby boom cohort has a profound effect on Canadian society. Never before have so many been so close to retirement at any time in Canadian history. Now, we're going to start this by looking at adolescence, that time of adolescence, moving, that the middle-aged family has adolescence. So middle family years, this is also a time for change for their children. They've physically matured, they've finished their education, they've moved from the parents' home and get a full-time job, find a romantic or sexual partner, and then maybe at some point in the future have children of their own. Now, this period is a time of bickering and disagreements over many things like chores, the use of the car, curfews. It's also a time for exploring the age-old question in adolescence of who am I? The role of peers can play a very important role in adolescence. This can include risk-taking and peer pressure. Peers are also helpful in positively guiding us through those years. We tend to find other people who are a lot like us. Now, that doesn't happen always right away, but it is an outcome that can be very positive. Now, adolescents have a better outcomes when they are coming from families with emotionally close and involved parents. Parents in these families provide healthy role models, and they also monitor teens' activities. Now, with positive communication and the supportive relationship, compromises can be worked out. Now, this comes back, if you will, to dialogue that I had mentioned in class before about communication and the role and the importance of communicating as a partner. That extends to that ability to communicate regularly and keep lines of communication open with your children when they're younger, so that when they emerge into adulthood, or teens in this case, what we're talking about now, is that there is this line of communication that can be open and helping teens through this period of time, rather than it being a time of an antagonistic period between parents and teen. Now, if parents were to react badly or accusatory to a child's disclosure, a vicious cycle can set in. Young person becomes more secretive and defiant, and parents become more suspicious and controlling. And this has, again, it comes back to this component of communication. The more we work at our communication and keeping lines of communication open, the better the overall improvements for that adolescent will be. Now, Erickson, he's a psychologist, and his psychosocial stages of development, he identified an important stage to establish one's own identity, answering this question that I posed earlier about who am I? Now, we enter the time labeled identity crisis in around that 18 to 22 years of age. Now, that doesn't mean everything is sorted out. Not sorting things out during this time can lead to identity confusion. Now, we probably all know people, and maybe ourselves have been experienced this, where we went through this early or our late teens, early adulthood, where we really weren't sure what we wanted. Whereas we knew other people who seemed to be driven and really clear about what they wanted. So, as a response to this, Erickson addressed 4 identity statuses, and we're going to review these one at a time. You'll see the image that I have there. Achievement. This is the first identity status. This is where the person has a strong sense of who they are and what they want. They're focused and committed. And I knew a few of these teens in my youth. I wasn't one of them, but I recognized that some people just seemed to know who they were and what they wanted to do. Others of us were less focused and less aware. Now, the second stage that Erickson introduced is what's called Moratorium. Now, this is about getting focused, but you're not yet fully committed. Here it might be like a student, they stay in school, but they keep changing their major or keep changing their program. They're committed to the notion that post-secondary is the way to go. However, they're not really sure what they want to do. So they've got commitment, they're staying in school, but they're not very focused because they keep moving from program to program. Foreclosure is the third. Now, this is being committed to the outcome, but very little focus here. Following a path to be a doctor because, well, it runs in the family, but you really don't want to be a doctor. And so that's sort of the opposite, if you will, of moratorium. And then we get into identity diffusion as the fourth group. Now, there's little to no focus or commitment. Now, this is an example of where a student might drop out of school because they don't have any interest in it. Now, that doesn't mean that at some point in the future, that student in any one of those groups mightn't change. Someone with identity diffusion, I know some folks who have dropped out of high school and then later found their way back into post-secondary, following a path of commitment and focus where they really found their footing, but it was much later than what we might normally experience. Now, there's a term within this area of adolescence that has been coined more recently, and it's the term called helicopter parent. Now, this relates to a parent who is obsessively concerned about their children's safety and that their children have constant success. Now, there are concerns with this approach, especially as children get older and enter college or university. There is also some support for this approach and a more positive. It's concerning, they demonstrate concern, they provide financial support and advice, and they're in regular contact and communication. So there are some benefits to this, but it's got to be balanced with allowing children to have their own successes and to recognize that life isn't full of constant success, that sometimes we aren't successful and we're okay. Now, in North America, there are no specific rites of passage that mark the start of adulthood. Rather, there's a gradual shift from one status to another. Begins in adolescence. Researchers are now suggesting that there's a stage after adolescence, which they're calling emerging adulthood. So let's look at emerging adulthood. In this area, it's roughly spanning those years 18 to 25, and it could be even later, as a period of relative freedom and a time for many possibilities. It's identified as a new developmental stage between adolescence and young adulthood. Now, scripts lay out the life course are no longer standardized, and that's an important variable because social scripts sort of prepare us for each stage in our life, and because we're starting to stretch some of these stages out because we're living longer, we're starting families a little later, we're having smaller families, these social scripts also start to adjust, and so they're not as standardized. So there is a fair bit of freedom to explore, and there's this little gap of time where we seem to have less responsibility. Now, when we visit Erickson, his psychosocial development stages again, we're moving from an adolescence to young adult. This is to about age 35, and then we move into a middle adulthood. Now, since we've been staying in school longer, staying in our family homes longer, starting families later, therefore, we all tend to take more time making our way to adulthood. Now, that's not all bad. Let's not misunderstand that there are strengths to that if one is not ready, jumping in feet first and trying to survive is not always the best. And we are taking our time to be better prepared for adulthood. Now, there are 5 features that separate emerging adulthood from the other stages. Things like identity exploration. It's also considered to be this age of instability. We also seem to be in an age of self-focused period, an age of feeling sort of in between, and an age of possibilities. And so all of these are occurring in this sort of emerging and towards adulthood, where we still are searching for clarity about who we are and about making things more consistent. Maybe we're going to start stretching our perspective away from just ourselves, but looking towards our children, feeling a little less in between perhaps, and actualizing some of the possibilities can all emerge during this time. So we'll move into this generation of midlife. Now, this generation of midlife, the middle years, have now joined child rearing as the longest stage in life. Because we've extended our life by years, in terms of how long we live, these middle years tend to stretch out a little bit more, and they've become just about as long as the time of child rearing. That 18 years to 19 years. The midlife group is diverse. It includes first-time parents in midlife who get married later in life and have children later in life, as well as great-grandparents. These would be from families who had children much earlier, whose children had children earlier, and thus we have grandparents. So midlife can be great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, first time, and growing with children in our family. So some begin midlife at the peak of their careers, while others are nearing retirement. It's quite a diverse, multi-access period of time. These years of the family cycle are transitional. The period often marks splitting of one family into 2 or more as children leave families of origin and form their own nuclear families of procreation. In this stage, we also introduced the term stressors. Now, stressors at this particular time are the kinds of experiences that emerge in our midlife that start to bring questions and stressors that cause us to have to react and deal with. Now, there is much going on at this particular time. There's more time considering one's own health, As you're getting older, some of the life experiences start catching up. We start to enter into where people might be passing away, so the death of a loved one, and financial problems. We're not only looking after our own family, but we might start expressing, and sending money towards children going into post-secondary, helping them out financially. We might even start helping out our own parents. And so that stretching of our finances can start to create bigger problems. Now, midlife, this involves a time for evaluation. We're going to start with the first sort of things that we do in midlife in terms of evaluation is to assess oneself. We take stock. Now, during midlife, individuals typically consider whether their lives, especially work and family lives, have been fulfilling. It's one of the first times we take some time to sort of start figuring out and sorting out, how did things work out? Have I done pretty well? Midlife occurs when children are transitioning to independence and parents are nearing retirement. This period of time is also known as, according to Erickson, generativity. This is a focus of one's legacy. That is to say that Erickson's point was that stating that the key issue in middle age is having children and passing on something of value to a younger generation. Now, this doesn't mean inheritance. This really just means your life lessons, what you've learned, passing things on and passing on skills, knowledge, perspective to a younger generation and allowing them to take that and do with it as they please. That whole point about that your own mortality is inevitable, and what will you leave to your children? And again, it's not just about the dollars or the house. Generativity takes on various forms. It could be mentoring a relative or a younger person, creation of some artistic works, or working to better the community through advocacy, commitment to family leisure time to transmit family history and values. It's a number of elements, but it's variable. Not men and women tend, as we get into midlife, our roles between men and women tend to get a little more similar. Women will experience roots to generativity more closely resembling men's. In the past, most research focused on the men's experience, as it has been the case for a lot of things. Career and public life seems to be the most important forms of generativity. Assumed women express generativity through less esteemed functions of having and raising children. It just really looks at this whole notion of how we pass on to the next generation, that men and women, although they're different as they're growing up, tend to become more similar, and when their interests and desires to want to reconnect and pass on to children's and the next generation. Now, also within this midlife time is another term that you've no doubt heard before, midlife crisis. This is this extreme strain as a person reevaluates his or her middle age. Quite rare, actually. Rather, most adults enter a quest for meaning in life, and this happens over a broader period. But the whole notion that when we get into our midlife, it's when we start to evaluate this. How have we done? What did we set ourselves out to do, and did we accomplish it? If we didn't, what is it that we can still accomplish, and what is it we're moving towards now? What's the meaning and purpose of my life? It had been my children, but my children are moving out, and therefore I start to have questions about where am I going, what am I to do now? So in this midlife, we get some sense of how our career goals are going. Are they still achievable? What can be done to alter things in order to achieve them now that I'm at this age? Are there any changes needed or any new goals that I have? This period of time is very challenging to ensure that everybody gets what they need. So what representations of the early middle age are represented in the trailers for films like This Is 40 and Date Night, and these, what representations do these videos or movies have that represent, what it is to be of an older person in middle age and how people approach it? Bucket List is another movie. And these are all examples of, sort of movies that are focused on this middle years period of time. Now, it's also at this time in the middle years that we start to have what's known as, or we start to experience what is known as a spirit at work. Now, for many, this is achieved at this particular time in our lives. This is a profound feelings of well-being, and the work we do contributes to others and to our community. And it gets this feeling of that our work is meaningful and what we do is of some value and meaning to the larger group. We're striving for a sort of perfection or transcendence, which really just means we're trying to get to a point where we do things with purpose, we do things conscientiously, and we do things out of just being able to do them and benefit other people. So we're not concentrating and focused on it, we just seem to be able to do it. This spirit at work is something we strive for in many ways. During this time, we do not only focus on ourselves and our careers at time, we also evaluate our close relationships. We're reflecting on our relationships with our children, parents, grandchildren, partners, siblings. We start to evaluate how we're getting along with them. Is it an improvement? Are we beneficial? Are they benefiting us? What's the state of the nation, as it were? Now, strong social relationships are really important during this period of time of midlife. It's really critical to have these. Now, in midlife, if we were to switch gears, we've gone from assessing ourselves and assessing our career. We also get into a broader range of intimacies with our partner and sexuality. So intimate partners, relationships, and sexuality. Couples who stay together may have to renegotiate some aspects of the relationship. They may have to renegotiate them. Now, as they adjust to a childless household, couples often shift towards greater androgyny, or in another way of putting it, or more balance between the masculine and feminine roles. Men might be doing more cooking and cleaning than they've done in the past, and women might be doing more leisure activities and perhaps volunteer work. So there's this androgynous, everybody's doing something within the family. Now, middle-aged parents with teens at home are more likely to be depressed than those with older children, in part because having those two things, having a teen in your house while you're transitioning from midlife to older age, is incongruent with the two sort of focus points or goals. Many couples will report more satisfaction in marriages at midlife. Sexual relationships of couples may change. For some, the interest in sex increases. For some, interest drops off through boredom, or for some, yet again, they accept the stereotype that older people are just asexual beings. Now, aging and sexuality are experienced differently by sex in North America. Men's sexual attractiveness is linked to success and often increases with age, whereas women's attractiveness is linked to youthful physical appearance and tends to decline with age. Now, that's a social construct as opposed to a biological imperative. Now, there's greater acceptancy now for sexuality and less opposition to sex for unmarried people. Reality, unsurprisingly, gives that this generation ushered in the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Men are more likely than women to try a variety of sex-related activities, whereas gay men are more likely to be sexually active. Those with regular sexual partners are more satisfied sexually and generally more positive about life than those non-partnered. Adults over 50 looking for a new partner, they increasingly are turning to internet dating sites. The fastest growing group of clientele are middle-aged people. Men want committed relationships. Women look for companionship without prospect of heavy caregiving. Both sexes stress that their youthfulness, either in appearance or in activities. Now we're going to move to a term that you've heard before, the empty nest. Generally, that is, homemaker mothers are sometimes described as suffering the empty nest syndrome, or depression and a sense of uselessness when the last child leaves the home. In fact, The empty nest often brings a couple increased happiness and marital satisfaction. Middle-aged people experience a sense of confidence and competence, particularly in their jobs during this period of time. So you might instead be able to say the not-so-empty nest. As you can see in the figure behind me here, the transition to independent living is occurring later and taking longer. More young people are in full-time post-secondary education than was the case in the mid-70s. Finding and keeping a job that pays enough is harder because of slow economic growth and that recession that began in Canada in 2008, and we're still recovering from that. Living with parents is increasingly acceptable, and as such, two new terms have been coined as a result: boomerang kids and the revolving door. The boomerang kids is children who return to their parents' home after having moved out already. The revolving door is young people's repeated moving in, moving out, moving in, and moving out of their parents' home. And again, these have more to do with the shift and the change of what is happening in these periods of time for these younger people. 1981 to 2011, the number of unattached young adults aged 20 to 24 who continue to live with their parents increased from 41.5% in 1981 to 59.5%, almost 60% in 2011. Among those ages 25 to 29, that increase in those years was between 11.3 up to 25.2. And so it's happening in larger numbers. More men and women are likely to be living at their family home. Now, living with parents is becoming more acceptable, but it does produce stress. There are some very practical issues that arise. There's an adjustment to the new roles, since old parent-child roles aren't really appropriate anymore. How you parented your 12-year-old isn't the same way you might parent your 25-year-old. Privacy becomes an issue between parents and children, or the use of the family car. Family rules and regulations that we used to have maybe are changing. Sharing of expenses. Do children pay rent? Do they contribute to the overall bills of the house? The use of the home for parties and other forms of socializing. Parents may feel the need to maintain control of their home, and adult children have the need to control their own lives. Therein lies some degree of tension that can occur. In some instances, midlife children return to their parents' home usually as a result of employment loss, relationship breakup. Both child and grandchildren may move in. Grandparents faced with renewed child care responsibilities to allow an adult child to enter the workforce. And that's happening more. Grandparents caring for their children's children. So on that sort of note of caregiving, we can broaden that up to say that caregiving for our elderly has always been a family responsibility. Our Canadian population is and has been growing older as the baby boomers age. In great numbers, just over 8 million Canadians have been caring for a family member in 2012. This caring is predominantly given to parents, in-laws, children, and grandparents. Women are a little more than men provide this care, with women providing up to 20 hours more per week for caregiving. Now, all it means is that the amount of the care that is being provided more equally than it had, but the women are providing way more hours per visit, if you will, per visit of care. Now, caregiving can include things like household tasks, like meal prep and cleaning. It could be involving care for the person, including transportation to appointments. As can be expected, a toll is taken from the caregiver. Stress, worry, anxiety are associated with the extra load and the financial stressor. Now, many in need for care prefer family support rather than institutional support, assuming that family would be better. And in some cases it's not, in some cases it is. So for the caregiver, balance all the demands, your own job and family needs, as well as those of the individuals in the need of care, overwhelming at times. However, caregiving can be very rewarding as well. So this leads into what is known as the sandwich generation. The sandwich generation is middle-aged children who experience the stress of the continuing dependency of their children and the increasing disability of their parents. In 2012, about 28% of caregivers could be considered part of that sandwich generation. Some of the factors involved, well, parents are now older when they have children, and the family size is decreasing. Thus, we have fewer helpers in the family available. Older children living at home longer. Fastest growing group in Canada is the elderly. Limited community and social services support, and we're seeing more about that in the news now. And what's ironic about that is that this baby boom getting older has been known for over 60 years, and we're only now getting anxious about we don't have enough community services and support in place. The burden of caring for elderly parents tends to fall on women. In contrast to earlier generations, many of these women have jobs now, which makes that much more difficult and more stressful. Caring for both children and elderly relatives can be stressful, especially for those with children and those looking after more than one older person. Now, the last thing we're going to touch on is what's known as the social time clock. In our society, many aspects of life are governed by age. When you can vote, when you can drive, when you can drink alcohol, they're all age-driven. Distinctions between life periods have become blurred. They don't have age designations as we get beyond those earlier ones. Examples like when middle or old age begins, when does that start? It used to be more clear, but now it seems to have gotten blurred. Yet people who are more likely to experience a crisis if life events occur are off time. That just means that, someone in middle age who's become a grandparent, that's early, or is retiring, that might be early. That off script, if you will, can be problematic because there are still social scripts or expected patterns of behavior for certain ages. They're not precise, they're more fluid, and that can make things more difficult for this age group. This is a challenging group in a period of time, midlife. And it's getting bigger and less clear than it has in the past. Well, I hope this has been helpful for you guys. Remember to check week 7 for your crisis. It'll be posted there. And keep working on the assignment, and we'll see you all in week 8. I hope you enjoyed Family Day. Enjoy your study week and get caught up. And we'll see you week 8. Bye for now, everybody.